The candles trembled as if afraid themselves, shadows writhing across stone walls, stretching like fingers over the body on the table. Blood glistened, refusing to settle, sliding slowly across tiles, reflecting the surgeon's tense, trembling faces. Each cut drew a silent scream from the flesh itself, a whisper of resistance that no steel could silence. Time slowed. Every twitch of muscle, every glint of the scalpel, every bead of sweat became a cruel rhythm. And then the body moved on its own, jerking, twisting, as if aware, as if it remembered centuries of dissection. Panic spread through the room. Instruments clattered, shadows coiled like living things, and the surgeons realized too late. The theater of pain had turned against them. Outside, Paris roared unaware, but inside, something older, patient, and unrelenting had claimed mastery. The laughter came, low and triumphant, echoing off the stone, promising that no one would ever forget this night or survive its memory. The candles shivered against the draft that slithered through the cracks of the stone walls, their light trembling like fragile hearts in the vast, suffocating darkness. Shadows stretched unnaturally, twisting across the floor and walls, creating monstrous forms that seemed to breathe with a life of their own. In the center of the room, on a wooden table scarred with centuries of incision, lay a body, pale and rigid, eyes wide and unblinking, reflecting a terror too profound to name. The air clung to the throat with a metallic tang, thick with the scent of iron and something older, a decay of hope and the fleeting warmth of life. Each heartbeat thudded with grotesque prominence, echoing through the cold chamber, merging with the faint scraping of instruments against stone to form a rhythm both cruel and hypnotic. Blood pooled at the edges of the table, dark and glistening, sliding slowly across the tiles as though reluctant to leave the living world, as if mocking the fragile pulse it had left behind. The surgeons moved around the table with deliberate care, their hands trembling, not from the fear that clawed at the edges of human conscience, but from the intimate gravity of what they performed, slicing open flesh, tracing paths through muscle and vein, exposing the fragile architecture of mortality with no veil of anesthesia to soften the cruelty. Their knives caught the candlelight in fleeting flashes, silver serpents coiling and uncoiling in rhythm with their unsteady motions, each cut a conversation between life and the merciless precision of the human hand. The body twitched beneath them, spasms too erratic and alive for comfort, as if the very flesh resisted the intrusion, murmuring silently through nerve and sinew against the surgeon's intrusion. The floor beneath was slick with history and ritual, stained with countless sacrifices, the cold stone amplifying the wet, grotesque music of the work. The room exhaled, a slow, oppressive breath that carried the smell of sweat, iron, and dread, saturating the air until it became a tangible weight pressing against lungs and conscience alike. Time had become an elastic thing, stretched taut by agony and attention, seconds dragging into eternity as the surgeons followed an unspoken choreography dictated by knowledge, obsession, and the morbid curiosity that had drawn them to the theater of suffering. Every movement held a fragile balance, a moment poised between mastery and catastrophe, where a slip, a tremor, a hesitation could transform the act into an irreversible calamity. And yet, in the midst of this silent symphony of terror, there was a strange, perverse beauty, the glint of the knife, the pulse beneath the skin, the slow, deliberate unfolding of human anatomy in its starkest truth. The candlelight wavered again, shadows recoiling and stretching with renewed intensity, and for a heartbeat, the room seemed to pause, the surgeon suspended in a fragile liminality, caught between creation and destruction, life and the cold inevitability of its unraveling. The body lay open beneath them, whispering its secrets in tremors and shivers, and the surgeons, bound by curiosity and horror, continued their grim, ritual dance, the room a cathedral of pain, shadow, and the unwavering testimony of mortality itself. The room had transformed into a theater, its stage defined by cold stone walls and flickering candlelight, and pain had taken its place as the star performer, commanding attention with an unwavering, merciless presence. Each incision was a choreography of precision and madness, a deliberate dance where the surgeon's hands traced the curves and planes of human anatomy with an intimacy both clinical and disturbingly reverent. The instruments glinted under the wavering light like silver serpents, each one reflecting the scene in fragments, a kaleidoscope of muscle, sinew, and the dark, thick red that clung stubbornly to the table. Sweat and blood mingled on the surgeons' foreheads and hands, creating a sheen that obscured the borders of identity, making it impossible to discern where one life ended and the other began. Every movement was calculated yet tense, a taut line between mastery and catastrophe, and each twitch of the body beneath their blades reminded them that control was an illusion, that chaos lay dormant, ready to surge through a tremor, a slip, a moment of hesitation. The smell of iron was constant, pervasive, filling every corner of the chamber, merging with the scent of cold stone and the acrid tang of fear, until it became an almost physical presence, pressing against lungs and stirring the stomach into uneasy knots. The air was thick, stagnant with the weight of observation, yet alive with the subtle symphony of pain, the hitch of breath, the faint shiver of muscle, the distant echo of heartbeat resonating through bone. Shadows from the candles danced and recoiled across the walls, taking shapes that suggested impossible forms, grotesque parodies of the human body, a visual accompaniment to the auditory theater. With each careful incision, the surgeons became both performers and audience, actors enmeshed in the grim narrative they shaped with every measured stroke. The body on the table writhed against them in fits of involuntary movement, every convulsion a note in the composition of suffering, every tremor a reminder that life still lingered, stubborn and unwilling to release its hold entirely. The surgeon's eyes reflected both fascination and horror, the cold logic of anatomy entwined with the raw, almost spiritual awe of witnessing life dissected at its most intimate. Their hands were steady, yet beneath that composure lingered the fragile thread of anxiety, the recognition that a moment's distraction could transform their theater into a nightmare of irreversible consequence. Instruments struck against bone with faint, resonant clicks, each sound magnified in the cavernous silence of the chamber, a percussion accompaniment to the faint hiss of breath and the wet slide of flesh under steel. The table itself seemed to drink in the violence, the grooves and stains of centuries of similar acts etched into its surface, bearing silent witness to the recurring ritual of suffering. Outside, the city of Paris slept or roared in oblivion, unaware of the intricate horrors unfolding within the walls of the theater. But inside, the room was alive, the boundary between surgeon and patient blurred, the lines separating observer and participant dissolved in the act of intimate destruction. The surgeons worked in concert, a mechanical harmony born of repetition and obsession, yet each moment carried a weight that could not be quantified, each movement charged with the potential to tip the delicate balance of control into chaos. Every drop of blood that fell and pooled on the floor was a note in the rhythm of mortality, a visible pulse of life fading into stillness, and the surgeons, bound by duty, curiosity, and an almost perverse devotion, traced the contours of this mortal narrative with unwavering attention. Time had ceased to exist in its conventional sense, slowed by the intensity of observation, dilated by the hyper-focus on minute details, the quiver of a finger, the resistance of muscle under blade, the subtle exhalation of air through nostrils that no longer seemed capable of containing life entirely. The walls themselves seemed to breathe with the room, absorbing the horror, reflecting it back in distorted patterns of light and shadow, until every corner was infused with the presence of pain, a sentient entity that watched and waited for misstep or mercy. Even as the surgeons moved with precision, the body continued its involuntary rebellion, muscles contracting against their will, skin puckering and stretching as if attempting to evade the inevitable. The sensation of touch was amplified, every contact with tissue resonating along nerves and bones, a dialogue unspoken yet profoundly understood. The flesh spoke, the steel answered, and the mind interpreted the delicate interplay of resistance and submission. The candles flickered with a nervous energy, shadows dancing like living entities on walls that had long since witnessed countless iterations of the same grim ritual, and the floor beneath the surgeon's feet was slick with the accumulation of sweat, blood, and history, a mirror reflecting the theater above it in muted, grotesque detail. The surgeons, consumed by their work, were neither cruel nor compassionate, but rather observers and participants in a continuum older than themselves, caught in a rhythm that demanded both surrender and mastery. Their eyes were unrelenting, tracing the lines of flesh with an intensity that bordered on obsession, noting every tremor, every change in hue, every subtle shift of pulse beneath the skin. The body's movements were erratic yet purposeful in their own macabre logic, a final assertion of agency in the face of inevitable dissection. Candlelight danced across veins and arteries, highlighting the intricate architecture beneath, the complex lattice of life made visible in stark, almost sacrilegious clarity. And as the hours stretched, the theater of the room deepened, shadows lengthened, and the presence of pain became almost tangible, pressing against the walls, pulling at the edges of consciousness, whispering in tremors and heartbeat that life and death were entwined in a dance older than memory. The surgeons continued their mechanical ballet, instruments glinting, sweat and blood mixing in a seamless tapestry, every movement deliberate, yet carried by the precarious tension that defined the boundary between control and disaster. Each breath, each twitch, each drop of blood was part of the composition, part of the unforgiving symphony of flesh, until the room itself seemed to exhale, a slow, oppressive sigh acknowledging the culmination of mastery, terror, and obsession entwined. The theater of pain, illuminated by flickering candlelight and shadow, became a realm outside time, a space where life was observed, dissected, and rendered into a narrative of unrelenting intensity, where the surgeons were both narrators and audience, bound forever to the fragile, trembling line between order and the chaos of the living flesh. Outside, the streets of Paris roared with the familiar chaos of carriage wheels striking cobblestones, vendors shouting over one another, the distant clatter of hooves mixing with the laughter and arguments of the night. Lamps cast pale, wavering circles on the uneven streets, yet none of this illuminated the true darkness that lingered behind the heavy doors of the stone building, a darkness that carried a weight the city could not perceive. Inside, time had folded in upon itself, thickened into a viscous presence that pressed against the skin and lungs alike, making each second linger as if reluctant to pass. The chamber was suffused with the scent of iron and sweat, heavy and inescapable, mingling with the faint, acrid smoke from the candles that trembled against the draught. Shadows pooled and stretched across the floor, writhing with a life of their own, sometimes mimicking gestures that had never been made, sometimes whispering secrets of previous victims, the echoes of agony embedded in the very mortar and stone. The patient's body arched in unnatural contortions, muscles twitching and straining as though consciousness had seeped into sinew and bone, refusing to remain trapped solely within the mind. Each spasm was a language of its own, a testament to the stubborn persistence of life even in the midst of mutilation, a dialogue between flesh and surgeon mediated by the cold precision of steel. Blood fell in glistening rivulets, dark and viscous, catching the candlelight and reflecting fragments of faces, instruments, and the room itself, creating a hall of mirrors in which horror and fascination intertwined so completely that neither could be distinguished from the other. Each drop of blood seemed to pulse with memory, a story too ghastly to be spoken aloud, yet impossible to ignore, as if the liquid itself remembered every incision, every struggle, every fleeting moment of resistance that had preceded this ritual of flesh. The surgeons moved with a quiet, mechanical determination, their hands steady, but never without the tension that defined the boundary between order and catastrophe. Every motion was deliberate, measured, and yet infused with a restless awareness that a single misstep could unspool the delicate web of control they maintained. The room seemed alive in response to their work, the walls contracting and expanding with shadows that shifted like breathing creatures, sometimes merging with the patient's form to create grotesque hybrid figures, sometimes recoiling as if recoiling from the very act of dissection. Time stretched and warped further with each movement, minutes becoming eternities, and within this temporal distortion, the surgeon's focus narrowed to the intimate, horrific detail of each cut, each twitch, each tiny exhalation of the body that persisted stubbornly against the inevitable. The floor, slick with sweat, blood, and previous stains, reflected the scene above in a grotesque, inverted reality, amplifying the disorientation, making it almost impossible to tell where the body ended and the room began. Shadows and reflections merged with the surgeon's own forms, creating a complex tapestry of light and dark, human and inhuman, reality and hallucination, where every glance revealed something new, something monstrous that had gone unnoticed in the previous moment. The patient's muscles contracted in jerks and spasms, each movement producing a subtle sound of sinew stretching and snapping, a quiet percussion that harmonized with the faint hiss of breathing and the wet slide of instruments across the body. These sounds filled the room as if composing a symphony of agony, each note resonating against the stone walls and into the very marrow of those who labored and observed. The surgeons, their faces illuminated by flickering candlelight, seemed both hypnotized and repelled, enmeshed in a rhythm that demanded attention, precision, and the suspension of conventional morality. There was no comfort in the work, no reprieve from the intimate knowledge of what it meant to dissect, to expose the fragile architecture of life to unrelenting scrutiny. Yet fascination persisted, a magnetic draw toward the grotesque, compelling each hand to continue its precise movements, each eye to trace the contours of muscle, tendon, and vein with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Outside, the city's noise persisted, indifferent to the horrors contained within, yet within the chamber, time continued to behave as if under a different law, warped and distorted by concentration, fear, and obsession. The walls seemed to remember each previous act of dissection, each scream and twitch, embedding them in the stone, releasing them subtly into the shadows that danced and writhed in the candlelight. Each reflection of the body, each shimmer of steel, seemed to convey not just physical reality, but a hidden history, a narrative of pain and endurance that defied articulation. The surgeon's hands were instruments of both creation and destruction, mapping the human form with the cold eye of science, yet guided by a compulsion they neither fully understood nor attempted to resist. The patient's resistance continued, subtle but unmistakable, as if life had diffused itself into the fibers of the body rather than remaining confined to consciousness, making every cut a negotiation, every movement a conversation of terror and survival. The room became a crucible where the interplay of flesh, steel, shadow, and light created a living tableau of horror, one in which the boundaries of time, body, and self blurred into a singular experience of heightened perception. Candles flickered, shadows danced and merged with the twitching, arching body, and the room seemed to pulse in sync with the patient's last vestiges of movement, each contraction, each tremor, each drop of blood a punctuation in a narrative that was simultaneously eternal and unbearably immediate. The air was thick, almost suffocating, saturated with the smell of iron, sweat, and the faintly sour odor of fear, creating a physical weight that pressed upon lungs and consciousness alike. Within this chamber, the surgeons continued their meticulous work, undeterred, undistracted, yet acutely aware of the delicate tension between the theater of their practice and the chaos that could erupt in the slightest miscalculation. Every incision was both a continuation and a confrontation, a deliberate act that exposed the fragility of life and the strange, unrelenting persistence of memory embedded in flesh. Shadows shifted, candlelight danced, the patient's body writhed in defiance and involuntary response, and the surgeons, caught in the liminal space between mastery and catastrophe, pressed onward, tracing a narrative of suffering, resilience, and obsession that seemed destined to outlast them all. The room had become a world unto itself, detached from the roar of Paris beyond its walls, governed by the slow, deliberate unfolding of life exposed and analyzed, by the tremor of flesh beneath steel, and by the whispered stories embedded in every drop of blood, every quiver of muscle, and every shadow that slithered across stone, waiting, as always, for the next act to begin. A mistake was made, subtle yet irrevocable, a misjudgment of depth and angle that tore through tissue with a precision that betrayed neither malice nor accident, only the merciless inevitability of error. Perhaps it was haste, a trembling hand driven by exhaustion or obsession. Perhaps it was curiosity, the irresistible urge to explore the hidden architecture of life, to map the sinews and arteries in defiance of pain and mortality. The scalpel sank deeper than intended, slicing through layers that had seemed impervious, and for a heartbeat, the surgeons froze, knives hovering, breaths caught in throats, horror mirrored in eyes wide with recognition of the consequences that could not be undone. The body arched violently, muscles contracting against the unseen insistence of consciousness lingering somewhere beyond the mind, beyond the surface, as if the very bones remembered all the previous dissections, all the betrayals of flesh that had preceded this night. Convulsions twisted the figure across the table, each motion a grotesque testament to the fragility of life and the stubborn persistence of will, and then, abruptly, stillness fell, the body collapsing into itself, a canvas of suffering now complete, lines of agony etched across skin and muscle, a final, silent scream forever frozen in the mind of those who had witnessed it. The air thickened with the scent of iron, sharper now, more insistent, seeping into lungs and clothing, permeating the stone walls and pooling in corners like a living thing, carrying the weight of inevitability. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause, a fragile, trembling suspension in which the entire city outside, the roar of carriages, the clamor of voices, the unknowing pulse of life, was held at bay, as if Paris had stopped to watch the aftermath of the surgeon's errant touch. The candles flickered in muted defiance, their flames shivering, casting long, quivering shadows that twisted unnaturally across the floor, stretching over the body in forms that suggested hands, claws, faces, grotesque parodies of human features. But the shadows did not retreat. They lingered, thick and almost sentient, coiling along walls and floorboards, waiting, hungry, a silent audience to the theater of pain that demanded continuation. The surgeon's hands trembled, a mixture of adrenaline, horror, and fascination coursing through their veins, yet despite their unease, the ritual persisted. Instruments were adjusted, knives wiped clean, the precision of dissection restored in a mechanical obedience to an unspoken code that demanded mastery even in the face of catastrophe. The body lay before them, still yet impossibly alive in the memory of motion, every muscle and tendon carrying the echo of its final spasms, the residue of resistance embedded in fibers that would never relax entirely. The room seemed to exhale, a slow, oppressive release of the tension that had coiled through every stone and beam. Yet this exhalation was not relief. It was a reckoning, a reminder of the fragile boundary between control and chaos, between human skill and the unyielding unpredictability of flesh. Blood pooled along the edges of the table, thicker now, more reflective, mirroring faces and candlelight in distorted fragments, a shifting mosaic of horror and fascination. Each droplet seemed to thrum with memory, recalling every previous incision, every convulsion, every fleeting gasp that had preceded this single, irreversible moment. The surgeons worked with methodical care, yet every movement was shadowed by the awareness of the mistake, the knowledge that perfection had faltered and that consequence had been invited into the room with a quiet insistence. Shadows coalesced along the corners, imitating the gestures of the surgeons, the twitching body, even the trembling flames themselves, creating a tapestry in which reality and hallucination intertwined, where every glance suggested motion that might not exist, every reflection a specter of past and future horrors. The body, though still, seemed to carry a residual vitality, a tension that suggested consciousness had seeped into its fibers, embedding memory in muscle, leaving behind a resonance of defiance that no scalpel, no ritual, could entirely erase. The room's silence was punctuated only by the faint, almost imperceptible hiss of candle flames, the subtle creak of floorboards under shifting weight, and the wet, slick sounds of instruments meeting flesh and bone in careful rehearsal, a grim music that underscored the fragile equilibrium of observation and action. Every surface reflected both light and shadow, creating multiple layers of perception that threatened to unmoor the mind, to make impossible the distinction between what was living, what was dead, and what was merely remembered by stone, steel, and wax. The surgeons moved around the table in a slow, deliberate ballet, hands steady, eyes unblinking, tracing paths they knew by memory yet approached with a renewed, tremulous caution born of the mistake. Every incision, every probe, every adjustment of blade was a negotiation with mortality itself, a quiet acknowledgement that control was provisional, that dominance over flesh was never complete, that the theater of life and death was always inhabited by forces beyond comprehension. Shadows seemed to pulse with intent, coiling around walls and instruments, hovering along the edges of vision, suggesting shapes too grotesque to identify, whispering of previous victims whose presence lingered in the fibers of the room, whose silent testimony filled the air with a pressure that could be felt pressing upon skin and conscience alike. The room itself seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with each movement, each exhalation, each silent acknowledgement of the body that had been violated, explored, and ultimately betrayed by a human hand. Candlelight reflected off the polished steel, off rivulets of blood, off pale skin now rendered almost sculptural in its stillness, creating a fractured, shimmering landscape in which horror and fascination were inseparable. Time, thick and viscous, pressed upon the surgeons' minds, forcing a hyper-focus that made each second last an eternity, a moment in which awareness of consequence and the persistence of life's echoes collided with the cold, clinical imperative to continue, to master, to complete the ritual even when the body's rebellion had already spoken its final, violent truth. And so they moved, precise and deliberate, yet always shadowed by the memory of the mistake, the convulsions that had torn the narrative of the body into something both complete and horrifyingly unfinished, the room alive with whispers of flesh, steel, shadow, and memory, waiting, hungrily, for the next moment to claim its due. Rumors of the operating theater had begun to seep into the shadows of the cobbled streets, slipping between alleyways and tavern corners, carried by whispers that trembled with fear and fascination alike. The air of Paris at night, thick with the scent of horse, smoke, and damp stone, seemed suddenly heavier in the districts near the theater, as if the city itself had absorbed the dark reputation of what transpired behind the unremarkable doors. Those who had glimpsed the horrors or survived encounters with the surgeon's work spoke in broken fragments, sentences shattered by the mind's inability to process the grotesque truths their eyes had witnessed. They spoke of convulsing bodies, of steel flashing in candlelight, of shadows that moved with intention, and of a silence so profound it seemed to carry the weight of eternity. Yet their words always faltered, leaving the imagination to complete the horrors, to invent the parts too terrible to recount. Despite the growing murmur of fear, curiosity proved irresistible to some. The morbidly fascinated, drawn by rumor and speculation, navigated the twisting streets with hearts pounding, daring themselves to peek through grimy windows, to linger near the doors, to imagine the lives being cut open and measured, their flesh rendered into instruments of knowledge and obsession. Within the theater itself, the surgeons moved as though insulated from the whispers beyond the walls, their obsession deepening with every procedure, each act of dissection becoming a ritualized confrontation with mortality itself. Each life placed upon the table was a new challenge, a puzzle of sinew, muscle, and nerve, and the surgeons approached each with a meticulous, almost reverent attention, tracing lines upon living tissue with blades honed to a precise, cold perfection. The room smelled of iron, candle smoke, and sweat, a complex perfume that seemed to thicken with every patient, every cut, every bead of blood that slid across the stone floor and pooled in familiar, time-worn grooves. Sweat ran in rivulets down foreheads and arms, mixing with the residue of previous operations, the damp fabric of coats and shirts clinging, absorbing the constant proof of life and its unraveling under deliberate hands. The surgeon's focus was absolute, yet in their minds, an obsessive rhythm had taken hold. Each incision was not merely a cut but a dialogue, a silent negotiation with life itself, an assertion of human arrogance over the stubborn persistence of flesh. There was a dangerous pleasure in mastery, a subtle intoxication that came with understanding the mechanics of resistance, of muscle reacting to touch, of veins and arteries yielding to the deliberate will of the observer. Shadows moved across the walls, flickering in time with candlelight, stretching and contorting in shapes that suggested gestures and faces that did not exist, as if the room itself participated in the theater, aware of the stakes and the obsession that filled it. The surgeons moved in tandem, hands gliding over skin and steel, instruments passing from one to another in a silent choreography born of repetition and ritual. Yet each motion carried tension, a fragile thread connecting action and consequence, every slip, hesitation, or misjudgment potentially transforming methodical precision into sudden chaos. The bodies beneath their hands reacted in ways that were never predictable, muscles arching, limbs jerking, veins throbbing visibly beneath skin, as if life itself sought to assert agency in the face of inevitable examination. Every drop of blood that fell to the floor seemed to pulse with memory, a dark testament to previous encounters, to the relentless cycle of curiosity and mutilation that the theater demanded. Candles flickered against the walls, elongating shadows that merged with the forms of the surgeons and the patient, creating grotesque illusions of multiplicity, of movement beyond what was physically present. The room became a self-contained world, suspended in its own rhythm, where time dilated and thickened, measured not by hours or minutes, but by the slow unfolding of exposure, the deliberate tracing of life reduced to anatomy. Outside, Paris carried on, oblivious, yet the murmur of rumor persisted, carrying a weight that pressed on those who listened too closely, as if the knowledge of the theater's existence imparted an almost supernatural tension upon those nearby, an unease that coiled in the stomach and crept along the spine. The surgeons themselves seemed to inhabit a liminal space between obsession and madness, each procedure reinforcing their sense of mastery, even as it pushed them further into the isolation of ritual and repetition. No words were spoken. Communication was unnecessary. Hands, instruments, and eyes sufficed to maintain the dance, the intricate negotiation of life and mortality, and the room hummed with a quiet, tense energy that seemed almost alive, responding to the smallest tremor, the faintest exhalation, the slightest flicker of candlelight. Each life dissected was both lesson and temptation, a reminder of the delicacy of flesh and the audacity of human ambition, a testament to the surgeons' growing detachment from the world outside. They observed, manipulated, and studied, yet their understanding came entwined with a strange, perverse exhilaration, a feeling that knowledge itself demanded sacrifices of blood, fear, and sanity. Shadows seemed to linger longer as the night wore on, stretching across walls and tables, imitating gestures and the stillness of bodies, as if the very darkness had learned from the acts committed within, absorbing intention and repetition into its inky folds. The room became heavier, saturated with past and present, with the memories of every incision, every convulsion, every bead of sweat and blood that testified to both life and its fragile surrender. The surgeons continued their work, meticulous, silent, obsessed, pushing further into anatomy and mortality, exploring the limits of flesh, while the city beyond remained unaware of the theater's grim output. Fear and fascination entwined outside, rumor and reality blurring into a single, tense anticipation, yet within, the surgeons moved in a rhythm dictated by obsession, curiosity, and a compulsion they could neither name nor resist. Each act of dissection was both a conquest and a dialogue, a negotiation with death itself, a test of human arrogance and fragile mastery over pain, a repeated ritual in which the boundaries between observer and observed, surgeon and patient, life and shadowed reflection, dissolved into a singular, hypnotic, and horrifying continuity. The theater of the operating room had become more than a space for science. It had become a world apart, a private realm where obsession ruled, where the human body was both subject and instrument, and where the line between understanding and obsession, between survival and submission, had become irreversibly blurred, leaving only the dim candlelight, the glinting steel, and the persistent, echoing presence of life dissected and examined, always waiting for the next willing or doomed participant to cross its threshold. One night, when the candles burned low and the air was thick with anticipation, the surgeons prepared their next patient, their hands moving with the habitual precision born of obsession, yet weighed by a tension that had been building for hours, days, perhaps even weeks, a tension that seemed almost alive in the flickering candlelight. The table was cold beneath their hands, polished from countless rituals, scarred with grooves and stains that told stories of lives surrendered, of flesh dissected and examined in meticulous, unforgiving detail. The shadows in the corners stretched unnaturally, coiling along the walls and floorboards, and the air carried the familiar scent of iron and wax, mingled with the faint, almost imperceptible tang of fear that had been left behind by previous occupants of the theater. The surgeons moved in a rhythm dictated by habit, instruments passing between hands with silent understanding, knives catching the feeble light in fleeting flashes that seemed to shimmer with expectation. Then, from the deepest shadow, a figure emerged, and it was not human in any familiar sense, nor entirely devoid of it. It was bound neither by the limits of flesh nor by the conventions of fear, but by something older, something patient, something that had been waiting through centuries of ritual and observation for this very moment. Its form shimmered in the candlelight, an ambiguous silhouette that suggested flesh and bone, yet moved with an uncanny independence, a fluidity that betrayed consciousness unconfined by ordinary anatomy. The surgeons, trained in observation, in the manipulation of life through steel and logic, hesitated, their eyes narrowing, instruments trembling ever so slightly in their grasp. The scalpel hovered above the surface of trembling skin, a tool of mastery poised to assert dominance over life once again, yet the life beneath it moved with purpose, orchestrating its own mutilation, anticipating and countering every calculated incision with spasms, twists, and jerks that were impossible to predict or control. Panic surged through the surgeons like a sudden tide, a visceral, uncontrollable current that sent instruments clattering to the floor, echoing sharply against the stone walls and amplifying the sudden chaos in the once disciplined room. Hands shook violently, eyes darted between the body and one another, and for the first time, the careful rituals of control that had defined their work faltered entirely. The figure on the table seemed to revel in the turmoil, movements precise yet erratic, a choreography that mocked the surgeons' skill and their assumption of authority over flesh and mortality. Shadows twisted and elongated, coiling like living serpents around the edges of the room, responding to the frenetic energy of the moment, pressing closer, absorbing the light, swallowing sound, as if the walls themselves had come alive to witness the retribution unfolding. The room became a tempest of reflex and fear, knives falling, blood spraying in arcs that caught in the dim candlelight, sweat and fear mingling with the ever-present metallic scent, creating a suffocating haze through which the figures of the surgeons moved, flailing and stumbling, powerless against the will of the body that had become more than flesh. The figure's movements were impossible to resist, as though the knowledge embedded in muscle and sinew exceeded any understanding the surgeons had cultivated, their training and experience rendered useless in the face of a consciousness older, sharper, and vengeful. Every attempt to cut, to control, to impose order, was met with a counter-movement so precise it was as if the body itself had anticipated centuries of human arrogance, had catalogued the rhythms and weaknesses of all who had entered this theater before, and now enacted a silent, perfect revenge. Screams erupted, harsh and raw, filling the chamber with a sound that had no past or future, only the immediacy of terror, yet shadows continued to press in, coiling over faces and instruments, blurring reality until the surgeons' hands struck stone and steel indistinguishably from the flesh of their own victims. The floor was slick with blood, sweat, and the residue of past rituals, reflecting the twisted forms in the dim light, and every surface seemed to breathe with malevolent awareness, echoing and amplifying the chaos in a way that left no space for comprehension or escape. The candles guttered and shivered, their flames bending toward the center of the room, casting fleeting glimpses of shapes that defied the laws of anatomy, of space, of reason itself. The surgeons' training and arrogance, accumulated over years of precise work, dissolved entirely, leaving them prey to a force that was neither living nor dead, neither human nor entirely otherworldly, yet undeniably present and aware. Hands that had dissected with confidence now trembled uselessly, instruments clattering again and again against the stone, while the body continued its independent orchestration, slicing, twisting, contorting, rendering mastery meaningless. Shadows coiled tighter, absorbing screams and struggle, extinguishing clarity, leaving only a cold, malignant awareness that the theater of pain had become a stage of vengeance, and that the boundaries of control had been irrevocably shattered. Stone walls, scarred and polished from centuries of ritual, now bore silent witness to the culmination of the surgeon's hubris, reflecting nothing but fractured candlelight, slick with blood, and the twisted forms of those who had dared assert dominion over life. Outside, the city continued in ignorant oblivion, streets lit by gas lamps, carriages rolling over cobblestones, the world going about its nightly rhythms, yet in the alleys beyond, an unearthly laughter emerged, soft at first, then swelling in volume, triumphant and eternal, echoing off walls, twisting through narrow lanes, insinuating itself into every shadow, every whisper, every heartbeat that dared approach the theater. The sound was both mockery and triumph, a signal that the past and present had converged in a reckoning that would not be forgotten, that the arrogance of flesh and human skill had been measured against something immeasurable and found wanting. The surgeons were gone from the room in mind if not in body, consumed by horror that had no name, trapped within the memory of the figure's movements, the orchestration of mutilation that had turned hunter into hunted, master into subject. The candles continued to flicker weakly, shadows writhing across walls and floor, but the air no longer carried only anticipation. It carried the weight of realization, a truth of mortality, control, and vengeance that would haunt every stone, every drop of blood, every echo of the theater forevermore. The body remained, still yet impossibly alive in the memory of motion, a testament to what had transpired, a relic of an encounter that surpassed comprehension, and the room had become a cathedral not of learning, but of reckoning, a place where life, death, and retribution intertwined in a single, suffocating continuum, leaving behind only empty, blood-streaked stone where hubris had collided with the eternal, indifferent will of forces older than the city itself, and somewhere, far beyond the eyes of the living, that laughter continued, triumphant, unending, and utterly alien.